For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 3, Episode 24 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our review of last weekend's Innovations in NAFLD Care 2022 conference starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
It struck me that actually a conversation like that needs to include more than the liver specialists, more than the patients, but actually our colleagues. I don't know what a cardiologist thinks. There are some endocrinologists involved, but just a handful. I don't know what a GP thinks about the names. We know that it's considered by enough people to be stigmatizing that we have to do something about the names. I think that discussion's over. The question is what name do we go for?
Medicine, but particularly KOL medicine, is very command and control. But some things we don't know, that's why we do research, but the things we know it's right. Trust us. Primary care doesn't have that luxury because they've got way too many things to handle in too little time, and therefore they have to decide where connections were, which is why Helen and Jean, in their basic presentation styles, were, I'm going to say, less certain. And then you go out to Marcus, which is entirely about patient empowerment, and if we put enough data in people's hands with a couple of algorithms, they'll make better decisions.
What was I surprised by? I think the depth of interactions, and actually first solutions coming up in the discussion, namely that a metabolic nurse could be one of the bridging aspects, or also how patient advocacy, GLI, has been positioned as a key stakeholder here that has already had so many interactions that maybe weren't always recognized at all levels.
Ultimately, they want to be empowered to look at their own sense of health and data to know which journey is best suited for them, or frankly, if this is not working, and whether I should need to do something else, and make it a data-centric conversation with that human being that we're trying to empower, i.e. our patient.
He provides more granularity on the data than is currently needed to reach a clinically decision. The depth of information he gathered also in this self-observations was just phenomenal.
If you look at Premiership footballers and elite sports people, they put trackers on their backs, so it measures everything so that you can get that data. So I suppose it's not that far-fetched from there, and maybe that's more comprehensive, certainly in metabolic trials of liver, fatty liver, of any of the conditions, to co-link them with all of the data.
This week, the Surfing the NASH Tsunami team attended the inaugural Innovations in NAFLD Care conference in Barcelona. Join hepatology researcher, key opinion leader, and conference co-chair Professor Jörn Schottenberg, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guests, conference co-chair and public health and hepatology key opinion leader Professor Jeff Lazarus, and physician, author, and entrepreneur Dr. Marcus Ranney, as they review high points from the conference this week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Today's episode of Surfing the NASH Tsunami has been sponsored by Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, a clinical-stage biopharmaceutical company pursuing novel therapeutics for NASH. Madrigal's lead candidate, resmetirom, is a once-daily, oral, thyroid hormone receptor beta-selective agonist that is designed to target key underlying causes of NASH in the liver. Resmetirom is currently being evaluated in 2 phase 3 clinical studies, Maestro-NASH and Maestro-NAFLD-1, designed to demonstrate multiple benefits in patients with NASH. Madrigal served as a leading sponsor for the Innovations in NAFLD Care 2022 conference we are reviewing in this week's episode. For more information, visit www.madrigalpharma.com.
Для всіх, хто цікавиться мережею NASH або загалом жировою хворобою печінки, ловіть хвилю.
Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to thank, again, our friend Anna Tokar for doing such a nice job of translating our opening line into Ukrainian so that I don't have to mangle pronunciation on a word-by-word basis. And as with previous weeks and future weeks, our thoughts and our hopes and our prayers are with the people of the Ukraine as they deal with this horrible situation in which they find themselves. I returned yesterday from a highly successful inaugural Innovations in NAFLD Care 2022 conference. The conference had approximately 60 people in attendance and probably that many again on video, asking questions and raising points even from video. If you were fortunate or wise enough to attend in person or on video, congratulations, this was a heck of a conference. But while the conference was clearly a success in terms of content and new insights, it was a profound technological challenge for the NASH Tsunami team. There was no quiet space to record interviews to the point where the interview I conducted with Zobair Younasi was drowned in background noise and can't be used. For a variety of other reasons, the breaks in the meeting that should have provided time to conduct other interviews simply did not work out that way. So in the end, I left the conference with no viable interviews for this episode. Finally, we had planned planned to add to this episode an extrasode from Madrigal's product theater presentation at March's Chronic Liver Disease Foundation meeting. However, we're having challenges with post-production, and we'll append that episode to this one as quickly as we can. If you're downloading this episode on Wednesday night or Thursday morning, you might not have the extrasode. If you're downloading it later Thursday or Friday, anytime after that, I'm sure you will. This episode itself includes two elements. One, a conversation that started with Jeff Lazarus and expanded to include Jörn and then Louise Campbell, discussing the overall Congress, its highlights, and its key lessons, followed by segments of an interview I conducted with Dr. Marcus Ranney, physician, author of the best-selling book At the Human Edge, and entrepreneur-founder of the company Human Edge, whose app in development, titled Mito, is designed to empower people to manage diet, exercise, nutrition, and sleep in ways that optimize their own performance and wellness. Marcus is a really interesting guy with some fascinating points of view on things we all care about, so you'll enjoy listening to that. The full interview with Dr. Ranney can be found in Conversation 24.4, which will post Sunday morning. I also suggest that you make any effort you can to find videos of the conference on YouTube. I believe that's where they'll be. When we have more information on videos, we will post at surfingnash.com. You'll want to hear a lot of this. And with that, let me take you to the beginning of my follow-up conversation with Jeff Lazarus. So listen, laugh, learn, enjoy. So we're fortunate enough that Jeff Lazarus, whose baby this really was and who co-chaired it with our good friend Jörn, is good enough to have 10 minutes while starting another, how many day course is this on NAFLD, Jeff, and how many other things are you doing?
So this course is 6 days, 3 hours a day. It's in Spanish and English and a lot more Spanish than English. So I presented today in English, but all the questions were in Spanish.
Which is kind of remarkable because I know how hard you worked over the weekend and what kind of shape you were in when everybody parted on Saturday. So I'm impressed that you're up and at it again on Monday morning. All I did was fly home for 9 hours yesterday, and I felt like I hit a wall. I can't imagine what it's like to get up and do that kind of course on Monday morning. Congratulations to you. And as I said to you before, I'm continually impressed by your stamina and your grace with all the stuff you take on. So thank you from all of us for that.
Thank you, Roger. That's really kind of you. I just wake up in the morning and say, onwards. You just suck it up and you do it, and you're doing it for the good cause. In this case, fatty liver disease.
So looking back on the weekend and the inaugural conference, as it was, what did you feel went best about it, and what happened that you might not have expected for good or bad and surprised you?
What I thought went best was, aside from everything working, all the logistics, the mics, the video, I was surprised by how many people were online virtually and how the questions came in and you could actually find them on the iPad or the tablet and read it. Everything just worked incredibly smoothly, and we have our secretariat really to thank for that. Jörn and I were in charge of the scientific program. But what struck me was the palpable energy in the room. It was fun. We had the science, we had leaders in the field presenting, but it wasn't a death by PowerPoint conference. It was engaging. Sometimes people shouted from the audience a question before the mic got there. People answered if it wasn't even their turn, and we just discussed the heck out of all of these issues and such a broad range of issues. And the other thing that impressed me or struck me was that it was very digestible. There were some very complex issues, and it was a multidisciplinary meeting. It wasn't that everybody understands hepatology and NAFLD, to the extent that the expert presenters did. And in fact, many of the expert presenters did not, because they came from general practice, they came from parallel or sibling therapeutic areas, and we all just discussed with the common cause of trying to address the entire continuum of care around fatty liver disease.
I think what impressed me the most is about a 5-degree twist from exactly what you just said. And I'll get to what I mean by that in a second, but I totally agree. The energy was real. I think that's right. Because I come out of marketing and because I spent my life looking at hype, when I see things like innovations I yawn. Now, it was you. I was delighted to participate, but I couldn't figure out what was an innovation really and how it came together. And to me, having sat through it and participated in it and shared and enjoyed it, the innovation was in some degree what you brought together. It seemed to me, I was talking to Marcus about this morning, that you integrated 3 separate streams into a single meeting. And that's at least one more stream than I had ever thought about in this context before. On the one end, you have the disease itself, F3, F4, diagnostics, drugs, high-end scientific development in the hand of specialists. Shift one over from there, and you get primary prevention. How can we use the ground-level healthcare system as it exists, primary care practitioners, allied professionals, specifically in this case nutritionists maybe, and supporters in diabetology, to do a better job of keeping patients from getting to that F3, F4 point? And then one to the side of that is about patient empowerment. The kinds of stuff, for example, that Marcus was talking about, which is how much data can we provide to patients to help them be truly empowered? And then what can that, or consumers, or whatever you want to call them, because they may not be patients yet, right? So the idea of radical patient empowerment, which is where I think Human Edge and Mito comes in, for example, and assiduous working with primary care and nutrition, the kinds of things Helen Jarvis, for example, was talking about, and then the high-end medicine, all those in the same room at the same time, interacting, I thought was really a fantastic thing. And even more than any of the individual talks became about innovation, and several of them were, the interplay between the three sets of actors I thought was profound in its own right. And maybe that's what led to questions shouted out from the audience and some of the other things you were talking about.
Well, thank you. I think actually one of the main innovations was exactly what you just described, that we had so many different people in the room. It wasn't that a new drug trial or clinical trial results were presented, or we now have new non-invasive tests. It was that when we talked about non-invasive tests, usually it's a group of liver specialists saying primary care should do the following. But here we had leading people from primary care saying this is the problem with what you're saying. So we were presenting and getting real-time feedback, thinking it through, and engaging again to find innovative solutions to problems we're aware of, but we usually just don't speak together about them.
Okay, so Jeff will be leaving us shortly because he just did a 3-hour course in English and Spanish and is still recovering from the weekend. But while we've been talking, Jörn popped in at the beginning of the next conversation. Jörn, how are you today?
Good, thank you.
I see you changed, Jörn.
No, I have my NASH t-shirt on.
You are? Oh my God.
Jörn, you need to turn the camera a little bit so we can get you full on. Right now I've got about half your head.
Sure.
And only the N and the A. Yes,
I mean, this was such a unique present from Jeff, and it took me totally by surprise. So I have changed in between, but I put it on for this recording.
I slept in mine, so I felt at some point I should put it in the wash, but it'll be back.
Yeah, for those who were not part of the conference, the closing number included Jeff taking off his shirt to reveal his NASH t-shirt and then giving Jörn one to put on as well. So they became kind of the Flying Nash Brothers by the end of the conference. It's a look. Next year, we're all going to have to wear our own NASH t-shirts to the event. Could you imagine a picture of the participants where everyone's wearing a NASH t-shirt?
Or no NASH.
Or no NASH. I'll take that too.
We need to work on our theme.
What you do is basically give them the choice of 14 or 16 different color combinations so everyone can get the one that expresses them. Jörn, I don't know how much of this conversation you heard, but what I was saying to Jeff is that I start with a marketer's skepticism about the word innovation. I mean, everything is an innovation if you want it to be, but that what I found so remarkable about this conference after I stepped back was the interplay of different perspectives on what health and health management are. You know, you talked about this when we talk about healthcare, but what we really mean is treating sick people. You made that comment at one point in the conference. But as I thought about Marcus's presentation and the Mito app, you even go past that. We're now talking about simply how to empower people who want to help themselves. And while what he's talking about right now is expensive and requires a fair amount of data sophistication, over time, that should make its way towards the mainstream as well, I would think. And it winds up being a really exciting and complex picture.
I agree, and I think it was the feedback I got. I haven't had time to touch base with Jeff and actually get feedback aligned here, but what people said is this was unique for a number of reasons, and one of the strongest arguments supporting this uniqueness is the interplay of the different key stakeholders that we were able to gather in Barcelona.
So I'm going to stay for just a little bit, but I've been chairing meetings and starting this new course that you're actually speaking on soon. Never ending, but I've just did 3 hours of it. It was fantastic and exhilarating, but I'm slowly starving to death and really tired.
Yeah, you've been working all weekend and now this.
Yeah. I thought it seemed like a good idea. Like NASH is fresh in my head. I'll just teach it.
Here you go. Piece of cake. So I should tell you, I volunteered to become a alpha tester for Mito.
Great.
Oh, wow.
When he goes up with it. But I'm thinking you should be too, although it'll probably scare the crap out of you about how you run your lifestyle.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned with that.
Yeah. So we only have Jeff with us for a few more minutes. Louise, Jörn, any comments or questions you have for Jeff about the event or impressions you want to share that you'd like him to react to? And then when he jumps off, we'll just go do our part of the episode.
I thought it was a wonderful meeting. I thought it was generally all round comprehensive to some extent. What was the most controversial moment, do you think, of the meeting?
Well, besides the ending, I don't think there was sort of an open controversy, but one thing that struck me was when John Muris, for example, just said, I'm a GP, you're going on and on about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and alcoholic fatty liver disease. I would just like you to say fatty liver disease with or without alcohol. And he just put a slide up. It was very simple. We are going to continue this global nomenclature process. The consensus statement I'm leading on the methodology. There's almost 300 people involved in all the major associations, but he just put it out very simply. And so I guess I wouldn't say it was controversial, but it struck me that actually a conversation like that needs to include more than the liver specialists, more than the patients, but actually our colleagues. I don't know what a cardiologist thinks. There are some endocrinologists involved, but just a handful. I don't know what a GP thinks about the names. We know that it's considered by enough people to be stigmatizing that we have to do something about the names. I think that discussion's over. The question is what name do we go for? And I thought he just came up with a very simple solution. I'm not saying it's the one I agree with or it's going to go in that direction, but it just struck me that the importance of being multidisciplinary, and then we invited John for that very reason, at least of engaging with GPs, but it reminded me that we often don't go far enough in engaging people. And in this big discussion around the name where they keep saying, different groups are coming out and saying, we have a consensus, we have an agreement. And it's actually an agreement among a very small group and often from the same discipline.
No, I think that's right. Simplifying it sometimes. We do have a habit in medicine and healthcare of overcomplicating things for what we're trying to get over. And I think he's completely right. That whole idea that you can then have a conversation with your patient. I think it could be due to your high alcohol intake, which has high sugar, or it could be due to your dietary preferences. So somebody else can label it within the conversation rather than stigmatize in the name, I suppose. So is he bringing it down to what we all want? To keep it simple, stupid, as Stephen would say.
Louise, that was my reaction. Those who've ever had this conversation with me know I am no fan at all of NAFLD because I don't think it's right, or I don't think it's adequately right. I think it captures some of it, but not all of it. I think it will be used inappropriately, and I think the science isn't good enough yet on that issue. I'm much more comfortable. When Jean said that, it was the first time it almost felt to me like the heavens opened up and somebody actually shined light through for the first time, for the reasons we're all saying. You're right. It fosters conversation. It's not defensive. NAFLD is a defensive response to NAFLD. Fatty liver disease is a simple characterization of what it is, and then, as you point out correctly, it leaves room for any form of conversation that needs to happen.
It also leaves room for the patient to say, or the person to say, how do you think I might have got that? Which is a far better opening line because it's engagement. Oh, you've got excess fat in your liver. Oh, how could I have got that? It rolls off the tongue, it opens up that conversation, and it allows you to dig deeper if you have the time.
Louise, when we decide to put up an episode asking, is fatty liver the answer to the question, you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, why not? Both sides of the pond struggle with the definition from MAFLD to NAFLD or NAFLD to MAFLD or whatever we want to call it, but Jean may have just solved the problem. Don't call it either, just call it fatty liver and then define it.
Given that MAFLD started in Australia, that's a big pond we're talking about. And yes, I completely agree with you. Jörn, how do you feel about that?
Interesting perspective. I think it's a very simple approach. But again, I think the efforts Jeff are leading is crucial because you need a broad consensus and there are different stakeholders involved there. It took quite a while to get to that point, Jeff, and you'll have to report on that on next occasion. It's complex. And in the end, I think the consensus through Delphi is the most important point.
Thanks, Jörn and Louise, for that. And I just sent you a new piece out. There'll be a consensus meeting on the 8th and 9th of July. What I think is important is that nobody jumps the gun. So I'm saying this as someone who, without saying what my opinion is, it's that, we have a process. The major associations have thought long and hard about this. They've nominated people. They're trying to be as inclusive as possible. And now we discuss it because a name change is a big thing. It can confuse patients. It can confuse surveillance, reporting, notifications, reimbursements. There's a lot to the name. We agree that there's a stigma issue. Fine. We need to change it to something. But it's not a popularity contest. This is a complex technical issue beyond, even if we do take a new name, there's still a lot of hard work ahead. Everything from even indexing academic work to be able to capture and work with the National Institutes of Health that runs the library and Medline. So there's going to just be a lot to do, and we need to be thinking all the steps through. And like Jörn said, there's a robust Delphi methodology in place, regular calls, and an inclusive process.
So Jörn or Louise, before I answer Louise's question, did either of you see a moment of controversy different than the one, or non-controversy, but constructive conflict is the phrase I'll use, other than the one that Jeff mentioned as being part of the meeting?
I think there was a little bit of discussion about the AI technology that Marcus Ranney presented, and looking at how that works or doesn't work and how accurate or not accurate it was. I certainly got a feeling there were some people that weren't necessarily, I suppose, sold on that way of monitoring. But is that the fact that technology is moving too quick for medicine, or is it the fact that I certainly don't understand how it works in that way, and I'd like to know a lot more? I just got the feeling there was some interested and more controversy around that than anywhere else in the conference, personally.
Interesting observation, Louise. And I think I would phrase this way, that he provides more granularity on the data than is currently needed to reach a clinically decision. The depth of information he gathered also in this self-observations was just phenomenal. It doesn't mean that from each of those data points, there's a direct clinical implication on which you have to act as a physician. But if you look at it from a research side, I think it'll be very informative and helpful. And obviously you need good algorithms, because it exceeds potentially one physician's mind to capture the complexity of the interactions in these things. And I think where the diabetes field has made much more advantages, they know well that they don't have to react to each of the glucose spikes to correct this with a drug or something. It's more, in the diabetes field, it's more to avoid, let's say, hypoglycemia in patients using insulin or being above a certain higher cutoff. From a science side, it's very interesting and stimulating.
I enjoyed the bit about the different types of diet that we try and get people to take with the different forms of exercise, and how that did or didn't affect the glycemic index on that patient. That was fascinating, because we say one thing, we encouraged it, and it did the opposite to, I think he showed, for him anyway, that we would have expected in the response.
There are other things in his physiology that are a little bit counterintuitive. For example, some of his history with COVID and long COVID. I did a half-hour interview with Marcus this morning that I'm hoping recorded well enough that we can use a lot of it in this, because it touches on some of the points we're talking about now and a couple of other things. I think that the controversy around the Mito app and Marcus's viewpoint is in some ways broader even than that, which is that if you think of medicine, particularly medicine as practiced by key opinion leaders, it is the ultimate command and control structure, right? I figure it out. I tell you, you do it. I know the data I need. I know the data I don't need. I know the decisions that have to get made. I'm good. This is the opposite. This is boatloads of messy data put into the hands of individuals using analytical algorithms that will address some of it, but maybe not all of it. And then we're trusting that the data in the hands of the individual processed through the algorithm will get you to the right result. It will not be perfect. Question one is it ultimately a better solution than top-down command control, where we are never going to have enough hepatologists to see everybody we need to treat anyway? And then question number two is, can we get the data into the hands of the people who need it most? Because the expense of what he's talking about doing, CGM and frequent blood draws and an Oro ring and a Garmin watch, that's not cheap. And if we're talking about downscale socioeconomic groups, the ability for those people to be able to collect that data, unless third parties are paying for it, are really dubious. Although 30 years from now, that stuff might be cheap as dirt and it might be fine.
I think it's going to be a lot cheaper, a lot faster than 30 years from now. I mean, this field is moving in leaps and bounds, but it's clear that this is not designed, for the poorest of the poor, or even the poor. What it does tell us is that with some simple tools, we can get information. For those who want to go all the way, they can buy all the different wearables and really get some detailed feedback. But for those who just aren't taking a lot of steps, the doctor can say, look, you're just not moving. There's issues, everything from social isolation to cardiometabolic. There's probably diet issues, and if there's a sudden change, why this month are you not walking after, what happened? What changed in your life? If you had a broken leg, that's one thing. But if you just stopped walking, it can also detect, I think, mental health issues in a crude crude sense. So like Jörn said, we're not going to need all of that data to make certain decisions. But for those who want to go further, they'll have that option. And for those to get some basic information. So the patient walks into the hepatology office after 1 or 2 years, they've had an F0, they're coming in for a checkup. You can know quite a bit about them if they and you want to.
That's an interesting one because it might give you, if you have data linking it to fibrosis progression, it might give you the predominant driver of the fibrosis progression. I sometimes say that the disease is very different in different people and you could then more specifically treat. So that's interesting. And of course, if as a hepatologist, after talking to Marcus, I would have thought about maybe there are ways to capture fibrogenesis. He's focused heavily on metabolic changes, which are easier today, but there are some emerging technologies to assess fibrogenesis markers. And maybe this is one way to also assess liver disease more real time than we can do today.
So Jörn, to give you one example, if I can get his interview to air, he talks about the work he's doing with people on metabolomics right now and a couple of other things that are an effort to bridge over towards some of the more conventional measures in fibrogenesis. His vision is, the breadth of his vision is really staggering and the ambition of it. And first, I can only root for him, frankly. I mean, not that it's perfect, but I think it's a really great direction to go in and to start to conceptualize. What I was about to say, Jeff, is I will never throw Jeff out of a conversation, but at whatever point you decide you're so hungry or so tired you got to go, just wave your hand. We'll give you closing comment. And
it will be soon. I'll just say that when I met Marcus, we were on, for me at least, my sort of ultimate health, I don't know what to call it, physical challenge, where we met and, the next day we started walking up Mount Kilimanjaro for 5 days together. I'll tell you, he was measuring certain aspects of his health. I didn't need any measurements. I was just exhausted, tired, frozen. No, I didn't need a doctor or an app to tell me, but I'm kidding. But we had these great conversations because he could tell me just exactly how exhausted, how low his heart rate was, how poor his oxygen intake was, and really sold me on the importance of this, but not just, we know the importance of it, but also how some of the really simple tools. I mean, I went right back home and bought some simple measurement tools, that you can use with your finger, because I'm often at altitude, and I was curious how it's going to be affecting me. And we talked through this, and that's why I invited him to this meeting to share this kind of thinking with the liver community. We know about it, but he's really, from a comprehensive metabolic health perspective, trying to drive that agenda forward. And I'm looking forward to working with him over the coming years.
And maybe, as Jörn said, that's the key. That's the sort of data that you would need in a clinical trial. You can really drill down to look at the difference between your placebo groups and not. If you look at Premiership footballers and top and elite sports people, they put trackers on their backs, so it measures everything so that you can get that data. So I suppose it's not that far-fetched from there, and maybe that's more comprehensive, certainly in metabolic trials of liver, fatty liver, of any of the conditions, to co-link them with all of the data. So way more data than we probably need at ground zero, but a lot more data to be able to analyze with AI. So interesting.
But I can tell you, Louise, there was a phase 2 study that captured just movement of the study participants in order. They were thinking maybe we can tease out the placebo response, and they were overwhelmed by the data. So they couldn't even, bring up the manpower or the computational power to set that into perspective in an individual. So it takes a lot. And I think maybe smart people like Marcus Ranney and his technology, but it's not a straightforward shot.
I don't think anybody, well, let me amend that. Anybody who understands the complexity of statistics in general, Jörn, I think would agree with you staggeringly quickly and completely about that. The great thing, though, is the computational power gets so much stronger and cheaper all at the same time that if somebody has mastered the right kind of stats, they can start to take a dive at some of it. Jeff, anything else you'd like to bring up for us to discuss before we let you eat and sleep? Two things I know are really important to you right now.
Nothing more from my side. Whether or not this makes the podcast, I just want to thank Surfing the NASH Tsunami, you, Roger, in particular, and you, Louise, who also stepped in and chaired the patient forum in the morning. I've thanked Jörn many times with many different hats on, but it was just fantastic to lead this meeting with him. And I don't know if you were on when I was asked earlier, Jörn, by Roger, but I mean, the palpable energy in the room, in addition to the amazing scientific talks, just how fun it was, just how engaging it was. People all working together to get to the bottom of this, to find solutions, innovative legislative or otherwise, but the innovation was the collaboration. So we will do this again in May 2023. We'll do at least one halftime webinar to bring folks together and chat. Nothing like the real deal, but we'll keep the momentum going. I'll look forward to seeing whoever's going to be in London next month for the International Liver Congress. And again, thank you for being our media partner at INCBCN, Innovations in NAFLD Care Barcelona. We will be back in Barcelona by popular demand. And thank you for that podcast you prepared to help us launch this. It was just terrific, and I think made a big difference.
Our pleasure being part of all this, because I think it's what you're doing is important. I have to put in a word for my co-host and your co-presenter, Dr. Schottenberg, who wants to know what it's going to take to bring everybody to Frankfurt for an event at some point in the future. But we'll leave that one for today, Jeff, because
I'll tell you what it will take. I have an answer to everything. And I think I'll be there on the 8th of June, because the Hepatitis HIV in Europe conference that I co-founded, but I still sit on the program board for, decides that the easiest place for everyone in Europe to meet is about 8 kilometers outside of Frankfurt Airport in this hotel in a field. And we go, there's nothing else to do, and we plan the meeting. So I will be in Frankfurt, but only in the airport, because apparently it's the easiest airport for everyone else.
Jeff, I have a sense that statement, there's nothing else to do, does not exactly bode that you will be highly sympathetic to putting major events there.
I don't think we'll be going to Frankfurt anytime soon. Jörn also mentioned Berlin. I could sell Berlin.
You can sell me Berlin in a heartbeat.
But,
I think we're good off in Barcelona. And again, the much personal note that was also brought in by Jeff is much appreciated by all speakers. And I thought really just echo his words and give it back. It was phenomenal.
And the discomfort, Jörn, on your face when he started to take his clothes off was something I shall never forget. Or anybody else who was physically watching.
You didn't know that was coming, hey?
Well, I guess we're a good team.
I thought you in that moment were deadpan brilliant. In fact, I didn't know whether you knew what was coming and you were acting as if you didn't, or didn't know what was coming, but you were so damn good it didn't matter.
No comment.
It should definitely be the first TikTok video with Tick and Talk.
Yeah, we can say naive inspired. This was the real world, not TikTok.
No, but you know what? It could actually wind up, Jeff, being the first TikTok video from a NASH meeting.
Naeem's hired. His 7-year-old's hired.
I like it.
Thank you all for having me back. I'm going to take a break. I've been in this chair most of my life, it seems. So have a good rest of the podcast, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Thanks.
See you soon.
And congratulations again on a fantastic meeting. See you later. So this entire episode is going to wind up being a bit of an experiment. We have a 15-minute recording with Zobair done in the cafeteria during breakfast. I don't know how that's going to sound. I have half an hour I did on the phone with Marcus this morning from his home in Mumbai, with occasionally his kids eating dinner in the background. I have no clue how that's going to sound. And then we've got this. And because of the way the meeting shook out, the early departure and other things, I didn't get to do the interviews I'd hoped to do. So we're it, along with Jeff. Starters, just simple groundbreaker for the three of us. In addition to things we've talked about so far, your one memory from the weekend that will last the longest.
The strongest feelings are linked to within the meeting, I think the intensity of the exchange between the different stakeholders. So starting out with a roundtable discussion and the patient advocacy groups, these were all very engaged and highly qualified, highly experienced patient advocacy speakers, and their word and their view on this was so amazing. And the second thing, the momentum between Jörn Murras and Helen Jarvis. Jörn Murras really being primary care and fairly new to the field, highlighting us that it takes a lot to bring this disease into the focus of primary care physicians. And Helen Jarvis, who's been a little bit more engaged and has experience because she partly trained in that, I found this really informative and helpful to guide us on what the next steps are. And from a personal perspective, I think Barcelona is, of course, a very vibrant city and very lively.
Okay, Louise, memory that'll last the longest.
I think the memory for me, obviously, the ending with the T-shirts and the taking off of the clothes will remain in my memory, etched into my eyes. I have to say that vision. But however, I think
your face was priceless. Louise is right. I couldn't take my eyes off you watching this.
And there's a couple of good photos on Twitter, I think. But I think the one that I suppose resonated more was the one that Cyril Corsi did on the fatal triple linking obesity, type 2 diabetes and cardio with NASH. And I think for me, it was the figures that she showed and drawing that stronger link. And that's not easy to do in 20 minutes, realistically, given how long we could talk about it. And I think it was those simple take-homes that she just showed about the strength of those bidirectional relationships and that triangle. If anybody wants to do catch-up, that is well worth looking, because of course we're trying to target engagement from endocrinology. We obviously had Ken Kuzi there, but cardiovascular and obesity, because their conference was also going on at a similar time. So having more presence in some of these conferences would be great. But I thought her session I really enjoyed.
Here are mine, and they're two, and they're completely different. First of all, I think this is merely ironic, but it's worth a note that the first time I should ever spend a weekend in my life in the same geography as Louise, they wind up having Tottenham and Liverpool playing Saturday night against each other in a match both need to win in order to make ground, and they wind up tying, which means they both lose. We had a great time, and we had Robert Mitchell-Thane with us, who is just a riot. So that one won't leave me. But here's the other one. I've commented on this a couple of different times already in various recordings of this, but it's the idea that there were three very, very different perspectives in that room, maybe four even, okay? The raw emotion of the patient advocates. And I'm mindful of the idea that every time you see a social movement, the emotion of the people affected by the cause of the movement is just so much stronger than everybody from the outside looking in. And because this is their lives, right? These are our livelihoods. These are our interests. These are their lives. And when you read articles, for example, about oncologists who become cancer patients, you hear the same thing, that they didn't realize how different it was until they switched sides. So being able to get that side in the room was number one, striking. The second striking thing, and I alluded to this a moment ago, is KOL medicine, in fact medicine, but particularly KOL medicine, is very command and control. We know it's right. But some things we don't know, that's why we do research. But the things we know it's right. Trust us. Primary care doesn't have that luxury because they've got way too many things to handle in too little time. And therefore, they have to decide where connections were, which is why Helen and Jean, in their basic presentation styles, were, I'm going to say, less confident, less certain is probably the better word, less certain. And then you go out to Marcus, which is entirely about patient empowerment. And if we put enough data in people's hands with a couple of algorithms, they'll make better decisions. Each of those perspectives has a place. The reality is, as we keep saying over and over again, we don't have enough hepatologists around to command and control this disease, even if we wanted to. In fact, we probably don't have enough hepatologists around to command and control all the advanced fibrosis, even if we wanted to, which means we need to make better use of other healthcare professionals earlier in the process. In the end, though, if we could pull it off, more data in the hands of patients who know what to do with it will not get everybody to the right solution, but it will get more people to the right solution more often than anything else. And this is really the first time I ever watched all those perspectives in the same room at the same time and started to see how they might blend, merge, coexist in disease treatment. And I think we're just at the beginning of all this, but to me, that was just a mind-expanding experience.
I suppose you're right on that. But I also think when you've got a forum that's so intimate, instead of something like ILC that's going to be next month, where you have thousands of delegates, you get the opportunity to really drill down. And not every patient representative or every patient organisation can be represented. And I know some come from certain angles and some come from other angles. The representatives who were there was Donald Cryer, there was obviously Robert Mitchell-Thane, and there was Jose. So they did an absolutely fantastic job in putting over the emotion and the seriousness, and obviously the pitching at governmental level, because they all have different levels, different passions, and different ways of communication have to be done at different time points. So I think that was interesting to see. Yes, every single one of us is in that room because we want to do better, we want to get further, and we want to make a big fat dent in fatty liver. But we're not patients. We always have to have a patient in the room. We also have to have a nurse in the room. That came up in several conversations. So next year, I would like to see a nursing section involved in that, because I think it is the hinge. As I said in the meeting, it's the first thing that patients interact with. It's the one that they last interacted with, it's the one they phone first. So I think it has a great power potential if levered in the right way by both and all sections.
That was interesting because both the GPs mentioned that and a number of colleagues. And I think it could be for me, it was a potential step to bridge that gap in knowledge, the information the physician maybe is not able to share, or the diagnostics to do and to educate the patient. So I think clearly this is something. There's some healthcare problems associated with that because they're not equally available in all settings or reimbursed. But I think this could be a very good way forward to address that gap. How do we implement this in primary care?
Primary care couldn't function in the role they play without nurses. And I think probably the whole disease path is going to require a lot more than that. I couldn't agree more. I was actually delighted that we did have one nurse chairing a session, even if it wasn't supposed to be that way at the outset.
Gate crash any party, as you know.
You did it. I saw you at breakfast at 8:45, went up to change my clothing, came down 20 minutes later, you were in the chair, and I said, boy, she has done a complete transformation. Very
it's
impressive.
The fact at 8:44 I didn't know I was chairing the first session until you sprung it on me.
I think I told her 10 minutes before, and she said, yeah, let me just grab a jacket.
Frankly, I think that was really fortunate for the meeting, not just because of my infinite respect for you, Louise, but also because it did get a nursing perspective, the questions that you asked did get nursing perspective into the meeting that otherwise would have, I think, been totally absent. Since you were so integrally involved in organizing this, what came off the way you saw it, and what came off differently?
I was very much looking forward, and I think I said that 2 or 3 times now, really that we're able to pull all these different stakeholders together. I mean, they all showed up. The feedback was very good in the end, and they all enjoyed the interaction. So this means to me that we've hit or made a valid point in that this being a relevant disease, there's knowledge gaps at certain levels, and we have identified some of these gaps, and now we need to work on it moving forward, how we can solve that. And that was the goal of the conference, and from that side, I'm very satisfied. What was I surprised by? I think beyond maybe the ending, which again was a very personal note there, the depth of interactions and actually first solutions coming up in the discussion, namely that a metabolic nurse could be one of the bridging aspects, or also how patient advocacy, GLI, has been positioned as a key stakeholder here that has already had so many interactions that maybe weren't always recognized at all levels. I think this was really something that surprised me. There's a lot of things going on, and I think we brought them together well.
I think the interesting thing there is even today, you do understand that the two sides of the pond are somewhat different in terms of what we know and what exposure we get, right? And I think that GLI would be one case example of that. Another one would be how we think about payers and reimbursement, obviously, because the economics of the healthcare systems are so different. And you kind of heard some of that between the lines, although we didn't. The other thing, Jörn, I would suggest for next year is thinking about bringing payers from both sides of the pond into the meeting as well, because someone's going to have to pay for all this eventually. And when we're talking about the softer things, primary care, nursing, et cetera, those are the areas that have a harder time getting paid for.
Yeah, I agree. I think this was something that was still missing. We didn't think we'd get that far, but I think we're in a good position now to extend to that.
What I really liked when you were looking at how it worked and how it didn't, or how it worked, because it all worked, but what was interesting was the split in the room. There were several people there who came from a more social background and looking at inequalities in care and aspects like that. And they really, really engaged with all of the information and perspective that they took from the patient advocates, things that I'd said, things that the primary care said. So what they took away from the meeting was different to how we as medics or nurses would have looked at some of the data, the agenda items and things like that. So there was a real sense when people were talking to me of the differences that they took and the strengths and weaknesses of every section, that they had a real take home from everything that was presented during the 2 days. That was pleasing to hear people say it. It was certainly something I felt that I took away from lots of sessions. There wasn't a session I didn't enjoy. There wasn't a session I didn't think was covering the points really succinctly in their 20-minute slots, which was absolutely fabulous. So it was well engaged, and if you never thought it was going to come off, it came off perfectly.
And one of the surprising feedbacks was maybe coming from the pharma partners. They said, this is better than any ad board we've ever done, because we get all the different opinions and point of views. So I think really the diversity of the opinion, it wasn't mainstreamly aligned. Like if you get all hepatologists, they tend to say similar things. And I think really the diversity and the mix here is what struck me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a second dynamic there, Jörn. Having observed ad boards from the pharmacy industry side for years, it always feels like people are to some degree singing for their supper They know what their clients want to see covered and the perspectives in which they wanted to see it covered, and it has an influence, subtle or not so subtle, on what people talk about and how they talk. When you put multiple stakeholders with vastly different perspectives in the room, and everybody is there because they want to be, that dynamic completely changes, because now you need to respond to everybody else you're talking with. And there is no financial primacy behind any of it. So you get a much broader and more open set of discussions. And I understand why the pharma people said that. That makes complete sense to me. I learned more here than I have in virtually anything else we've done.
Well, Jose Villanese, I think you pronounce her name, but I apologise to her if that is not. The Dutch Liver Patients Association, she was very key. People want to give you something that they think will work, but don't ask the patient what they need. And I think that was her phrase. She said it a lot of times. Don't give us what you think we want, ask us what we need. So for anybody who hasn't seen or got caught up or didn't attend the conference, those key words are really, really important. Give them a cream that manages scars. They don't want that. They wanted a cream that stopped them itching in the first place. So actually check out what they need, because you might be investing an awful lot of money in something that floats your boat but doesn't actually address the patient need. So I think she was absolutely key in that. For any ad board, you need to look at what they need, not what you think they want.
Excellent. To me, that thought replaces nothing about us without us, right? Because it goes one past that. You could have us in the room, but you have to. What are you focusing on? I couldn't agree more. I thought she was maybe the single most surprisingly compelling person in the meeting to me. I thought she was fantastic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And she walked everywhere. Even better, she was getting her clocking her steps up.
So, Jörn, was there a specific presentation that gave you information that you found surprising, or you hadn't known, or even was in conflict with things you thought you did know?
Well, I think each presentation was unique. I'm reflecting on some, let's say, of the hepatologists where I would think that I knew most of the data. Alina Allen did a nice job because she highlighted some of the pitfalls of using, let's say, FibroScan in the general population, discussed the negative and the positive predictive values. And if I pair that with the information, again, that came from Jean Maurice and the primary care docs, they said, we need these tools, and they have to be based on our needs. Which patients do we really have to refer on? I thought that was unique. Marcus Ranney had a lasting experience because it was a very personal talk. He included these personal experiences. He called it N=2, but it was a nice way to pick the data. Zubair did a great job. I think I've seen that data before, but it's always nice to see him presented. He has so much of a presence, so well renowned. And even Stephen, who's not with us here tonight, but over the internet, did a marvelous job. And I like, he, maybe you remember, but he showed the same MOAs or substances in two different ways, dissecting them and who's in phase 2, who's in phase 3, and then looking at it from the perspective, what's oral, what's subcutaneous. That's a refreshing way, instead of detailing all the phase 2 or preliminary data and saying, because it's so relevant to the core of the innovations in NAFLD workshop, where we want to say we want to implement something, and what could be more relevant than how the application is going to be, sub-Q or oral, and it will be different for different patients. Even within the data sets that I might have known, I thought the unique perspective of the speakers, which were all fabulous, brought in so much more. It broadened the way you look at it.
I couldn't agree more. I had that reaction listening to Alina and then listening to Steve, and I saw that reaction to a meaningful degree listening to Ken, which was the first talk in that round of 3. But I think you're right. When you broaden the audience, shorten the time for the talk, and define the focus differently, if you're dealing with people who take it seriously, and all 3 of those people take everything they do seriously, what you'll get is what you got, which is the focus will change to reflect the question, the audience, and the time frame, and you start distilling down to what really matters.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting. I obviously raised the question with Alina on the data with FibroScan, FIB4, and NAFLD fibrosis score, that if you only use FibroScan for kilopascals, you only pick up the stiffness. And I think Lauren Sanderin, who was there, was actually quite clear. FibroScan picks up stiffness. It's medical world that define that stiffness correlates to fibrosis. EchoSense and FibroScan do not define fibrosis, they define stiffness. But also, we don't look at a systolic blood pressure and give that alone. We need a diastolic. Now we have so much more with CAP. So poor liver health may just be high liver fat, because we know it's not benign, irrespective of stiffness. So when we're looking at these, we really now need to also, if you want to split it to just kilopascals and stiffness, that's NASH. That's definition and moving people out. You can argue that. But if you want to look for fat in the liver and fatty liver, where you can put an incentive to somebody and look at their other risk factors, then you don't need kilopascals, you just need CAP. But to actually separate them out now, when we've certainly had CAP since 2014, I believe, we should be seeing this data in all the studies and how relevant or irrelevant it is. Because I think you now can't have them both separate. And I do understand why, but I think we've now got to take the whole of the sum.
And here comes the next thing that was unique. When you normally discuss this with hepatologists, yes, the presence of fat, yes or no answer is relevant to make the diagnosis of NAFLD. But fat or CAP hasn't been linked to outcome, and it's typically not something that's used by the regulators to define that this is a treatment-relevant disease. If you look at it from the way that Louise has repeatedly stressed, it's not about disease, it's about liver health. CAP is all of a sudden the single most important factor because it predicts how likely you are to develop diabetes, at least hepatic steatosis does, and develop subsequent complications. So as an individual, you might want to know that. As a regulator, you might not care because that's not what you're going to approve a drug on, or as a pharma company, because you're not going to choose that population to be included in a study. Now, that's not totally true because the FAST score includes CAP and E and AST, and it considers fibrosing NASH, but that's a surrogate again. So I think the CAP is crucial to inform about liver health, and this is something that is so important to patients, and sometimes we focus too much on identifying the advanced cases that we could enroll in trials or that are relevant for the drug approval.
So that makes tremendous sense, and the logical follow-on to that is the CAP becomes a lot more important. Fat becomes a lot more important in primary care, right? Because there, in fact, we are focusing more on how you don't get from early signs of liver problems out to both the metabolic issues and to an increasingly worsening liver health.
Yeah, I would say it becomes important in prevention. And
exactly. Thank you. Much better put than I did. But that is what pulls me to primary care, which is that within medicine, that will be the locus of prevention. Well, that in nursing. But basically, before you get out, the hepatology specialist is where that's going to happen.
And I know prevention is hard to quantify when we do cost effectiveness. It's actually important. If you just said, what detects more liver disease? Is it liver stiffness by FibroScan or MRI or any of these other non-invasive, or is it a blood test? Because a blood test isn't going to tell us one way or the other. If you then say which one for the cost per each individual detected, who we missed or we didn't miss, then it's a different argument. And particularly if we put it into CAP as well as kilopascals, then that is a totally different cost effectiveness argument on locating people in pre-diabetes conditions or cardiovascular. So, and I don't think any of that analysis has been done, but it restricts it currently.
I don't know if that was salt or pepper, but one of Louise's cats was violently agreeing with her last statement, if you could hear it in the background. So, Louise, was that salt or pepper who was agreeing?
That was Pepper wanting to get into the room next door. They've not had enough affection. I've been away out in Barcelona.
So we're at an hour, including Jeff, and I've got other tape to integrate here, so I think we should just about wrap up. So we've said that what we might like to see next year are nurses, maybe payers. Jörn, anything else you're envisioning? And you certainly, we get opinions. You get one of the votes that matters. Anything you're envisioning for next year already? Besides, you can't top the changing the shirts at the end of the meeting, so I don't know what y'all are going to come up with for that, but Jeff's a pretty creative guy. I'm sure I'll get something.
Don't put that out there because they will.
The challenge is on, and we'll give our best. We left the meeting with the feeling, wow, we'll have to think of something that exceeds that next year, and that's not going to be so easy. Again, there's a lot of feedback that came through and said this was really an exceptional meeting, and we're very happy about that. So we're really looking forward to it. And really to break down the time until May 2023, there will be this halfway online workshop to also start discussing or continue the discussion of some of these. And I'm hoping we're producing a conference proceedings summary here with us so that we can actually put some of these thoughts and ideas we had into the scientific and academic discussion. So that's something that's hopefully forthcoming. I agree that payers could be a good perspective. It's not easy because we're talking about different systems. So it might be a high-level approach of a payer. Maybe somebody who could discuss a little bit about the value of prevention, as Louise mentioned, versus how much reimbursement is relevant. We haven't had a regulator, so either EMA or FDA. This is something that could be interesting moving forward. On the other hand, they're not so intrinsically crucial to this because we really want to, with the implementation of care, we want to implement the care. That means if a drug is approved, we'll use it. It's not so much about how does the drug get to the market or gets approved. Would rather start after it's approved and then implement it into the clinical field, I guess, as we discussed with lifestyle. And maybe that's a point that we can, I think think the idea that Louise brought up is we need a nurse that supports lifestyle changes, or maybe like a patient, maybe bring in one of the patient advocate. Donna Cryer mentioned this. I think she called it partner or guide or something, somebody who's next to a patient and tells about his journey that most likely in a different or more severe end-stage liver disease situation accompanied the patient and hear on their perspective.
All interesting. All very, and I think all helpful. I agree with you, by the way, that regulators might be the least interesting people of all, since this is not fundamentally a drug meeting. The person who wasn't there, and it's funny, Jeff and I were WhatsApping a little bit this morning, and he sent me, one of the things he was presenting today to the meeting was the 2019 epidemiology paper. And as I was looking at it, I realized if I wanted to pick one person I would have loved to have seen in that meeting who wasn't there, someone we've had on podcast actually, was Chris Estes, to come in and actually talk about the pathways that the disease is taking on a country-by-country basis in major markets. It would have been the natural adjunct to what Zobair did. And, the depth of Chris's data and his ability to pull stuff together really on the fly, as I've witnessed because we've asked him questions he was not prepared for when he got on the podcast, and he never misses a beat. I thought that's an individual or a perspective that might have been a real addition.
And I think the interesting thing, if you combine that with what Jörn was talking about there, with people who've got a vested interest, and I'd like to see some of the big insurance companies, because I think it was Alina Allen that showed the data of cost per patient with NAFLD, and ask the insurance companies how they can just hose money and not go for detection and just still rely on a blood test. So the big ones that go globally, Bupa, you've got some big ones in the US that go around, Vitality Health. There's international ones that work in every area of the world. So I've seen an article recently that estimated the spend in America by 2025 is going to be $1 trillion a year. The spend in Europe is going to be $334 billion a year. And yet we have insurance companies still not covering their patients, still not looking for anything other than the type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular. I don't understand that you can hose that amount of money and not even be looking to prevent it. Maybe it's just me.
So brief digression about health economics and why insurers work that way. In the States, at least, they turn over a third of their patients every 3 years. And therefore, it's become kind of the opposite of the prisoner's dilemma, which is your attitude becomes, if I'm going to lose the patient, I don't care what happens in year 5. Whereas, in fact, if everybody decided they cared about what happened in year 5, they're all flipping these patients back and forth, they would all save money. But in the short run, nobody steps up to do that.
So here you need the healthcare systems to step in and say we got to need a incentive for the companies to provide that, even if they change, because as a system, as a whole, and I think maybe that's more feasible in a European way where it's more socialized, the spendings, this could be better.
So, Jörn, maybe the session you need then is the advocates, almost what we did last week, but with more people, right? Coming in and talking about, oh, and by the way, that might solve another issue, which is if you want a fascinating closing session for next year, thinking about Achim Kautz coming in on a unicycle, doing something, juggling balls, shooting T-shirts out at the audience. I mean, he's a talented guy. He'll come up with something, but I would think Achim would be a consultant you'd get for your closing episode for season 2.
Yes, or you put the insurance companies about your year 5 in the same room with some boxing gloves as the patients, and then see who comes out on top.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
But insurance companies want people to live longer to pay longer premiums. If we get to the nuts and bolts of it, and I know they pay out, but the longer you live, the more insurance premium you pay, and the healthier you are, which saves them money and care. So when you bring it down to they don't want to pay as much on health. They want to have you live longer to pay more insurance premiums. So by targeting metabolic health and liver disease, they can get a real win here. But I'll provide the towel when they throw it into the ring to give up.
That's great. And Jeff, in whatever garb he chooses, and Jörn will walk around with the cards between rounds, saying card round 2, round 3, round 4.
I don't see myself in that position yet, but we'll see. We'll come up with something. It'll be worth the trip.
Well, this was worth the trip. I had real high expectations for this meeting, and you folks just smashed them. Better than I thought this was going to be big. Really interesting. It was bigger than I thought. I wound up leaving. My test on stuff like this is, do I leave thinking about things I didn't realize I'd be thinking about? And that 3-part vision of the specialist, the generalist, and then the empowered data patient, without even thinking about the typical patient advocate role, kind of what Jose was talking about. The interplay of those groups and asking, well, what does that mean going forward, was a bigger question than I thought I'd be thinking about. My hat's off to you. I thought it was great.
Thanks. And again, it was an entire team effort, and mostly the speakers giving those fabulous presentations.
We will be in Barcelona at the end of next May, and maybe Louise will even have an official role next time.
Instead of Gobby, who just get steps in at the last moment when somebody's not there.
No. All it means is that you'll come down to breakfast dressed the way you're supposed to be for the meeting instead of having to run back up at 10 of 9. Other than that, it would be the same thing.
Quite possibly, but it was funny yesterday, just to sum up when you were talking about next year, I stayed in Barcelona because I've decided that if I'm going to go to a meeting, my life is about enjoying part of it rather than just trying to catch my tail. But they had the marathon or the fun run on, so everybody was running, and then they had this huge group of drummers. Now I know who you can use for next year's conference because they were amazing. They just drummed and everybody just partied. But it was a fitness day in Barcelona yesterday, along with my 22,000 steps. But there you go. You've got a drum encore.
Excellent. So I will be back with the business section in a couple of minutes. And thanks to both of you, and congratulations, Jörn, to you and to Jeff and to everybody who helped put this meeting together. And we'll be back next week.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, folks.
Bye-bye, Louise.
Bye-bye, folks.
See you. Bye-bye.
My interview with Dr. Marcus Ranney starts with a conversation about how he went along his path from classically trained physician to health optimization and wellness entrepreneur.
Yeah, so it was a phrase that was mentioned in the conference, and I think Jörn mentioned it first, this idea of health care. As doctors, as physicians, we call ourselves healthcare experts, but really there's very little health in our care. It's mainly a pathogenic disease-centric system. And that's just the way it is, which is fine. But I became more and more disenfranchised with this idea of just looking at the sick element and started my own journey of figuring out, well, if I want to augment my health, my well-being, my longevity, what are the various things that I need to do? And that led me down a journey. I was a management consultant for about 4 or 5 years. I then founded a venture fund, which started to invest in interesting mobile technologies to help individuals enhance their health, from nutrition apps to personal at-home gene testing apps to dietary recommendation apps, telemedicine apps, etc. And then I sort of fell into this idea of entrepreneurship, and really, as I increasingly became more and more fascinated with metabolic health from my own study of longevity, particularly catalyzed through the pandemic. And I fell ill with COVID the first time in the first wave, which was in August of 2020. And I've often spoken about this because I think it's important for people to appreciate that, yes, whilst this is a disease mainly of the elderly, mainly of people with comorbidities, there is a significant population who are young, who are fit, who are healthy, who do get the disease, and who are impacted very significantly. And unfortunately, I found myself in that category. I have since had the virus 3 times. Each time it takes me at least a minimum of 2 months to get over it, specifically because of the long COVID syndromes that I have. And in the first wave, when I had this, because everything was so new, I was put on high-dose steroids for a long period of time. And that unfortunately tipped my metabolism towards becoming pre-diabetic. And since then, I've had to really look at my blood glucose levels very carefully. That sort of led me to this idea that there is this huge amount of data that each of us is creating. The average person in the Western developed world creates 2 megabytes of data a second. All of that is basically being used to watch something we shouldn't watch, date someone we shouldn't, buy something we shouldn't, eat something we shouldn't, etc. Very little is used to augment the human experience. And that was where the fascination came in, is can I use that information about myself first to build a mechanism to help me hack my operating system, which is my physiology, and that sort of unearthed this product that we're now building at Human Edge I presented at the conference.
So that application is called Mito. Am I correct?
Exactly. Inspired by, as I said, mitochondria, 20 years in the making. In Halloween of 2005, I was so obsessed with this damn thing that on Halloween, I actually dressed up as Captain Mitochondria. I made him up. I had a cape of invincibility. I had a mask of efficiency. I had all these little superpowers. Yes, and once again, my wife didn't know me at the time. She's very grateful for that. But that costume still hangs proud in various parts of my cupboard. And who knows, one day maybe it'll come back.
How old were you in 2005?
I was 21. Yeah, 21 years old.
Much better. I had this fear that you were 7. So how does Mito, the app, work?
The application is a very simple premise. It's based on the premise that we're creating a lot of information and data about ourselves. That data currently resides in various silos, various real estates of technology. It may exist in an app, it may exist in a device, it may exist in a platform. The idea of Mito is to bring that information together in an integrated, holistic manner. And that information, by the way, is your information of your biology. CGM, continuous glucose monitoring data from the Abbott or the Dexcom patch. Your sleep data, which might come to from your Oura Ring. Your step data, your heart rate variability data, which might come to from your Apple or Garmin device, etc. So there is a growing group of individuals who have access to these technologies. It's actually exploding, by the way. In 2020, it was an $8 billion industry. At the end of next year, at the end of 2022, it will be a $21 billion industry globally. So the idea was to bring this information into a platform, integrate that to allow individuals to then look at it, firstly in an integrative, holistic manner. But then secondly, this is where the intelligence comes in, is running a series of different algorithms that we've been building with various professors and institutes here in order to help the individual know to then understand what is that prescriptive thing. So yeah, I'll share the example of what I shared with the audience at the conference a few days ago. And this was N=2. This was the data for me and the data for my wife. When is we uploaded all the same information. So 4 weeks of continuous glucose monitoring data, a specific metabolic panel for the audience. It was our lipid profile, AST, HbA1c, fasting, insulin, and uric acid. So blood-based panel, CGM data, and 4 weeks of Apple Watch data. This was specifically looking at nutritional output and exercise output. So when it came to nutrition, it recognized that for my body, I require 2,200 kilocalories a day. That based on the responsiveness of my insulin levels and the responsiveness, therefore, in my CGM data, that I should be mainly on a low carb, so carbohydrate diet, less than 15% fats and then proteins, and that I should break my meals into 4 smallish meals in the day rather than do what I currently do, which is take an 16 to 18 hour fasting window and then eat one massive meal at end of day. And then specifically looking at all the exercise parameters that my Apple Watch logs in, skiing, cycling, swimming, running, walking, trekking, etc., in order for me to maintain a state of energy neutrality end of day for each of those exercise parameters, what frequency, what volume, and what intensity I should do to maintain that. And, as one could expect for Ranney, it was fundamentally different. For her, it was 1,800 kilocalories. For her, it was the fact that she can actually have a much higher carbohydrate load. Up to 50% of her diet can be carbohydrates. And she can actually do very well with her fasting, so 2 meals in a day rather than my 4 smallish meals in a day. And then obviously the exercise was curated to her, which is mainly high intensity, Tabata, Pilates, yoga, walking, etc. So I always find this fascinating because I think for the physicians in the audience who have patients who come to them asking, doc, should I be doing X? Should I be doing Y? What is the diet that I should be on? How much exercise that I should be taking, etc. We are moving in a direction that's able to understand the person sitting in front of us, the data which is being created on the back of the devices that they currently already have, and that device load is just going to increase exponentially over a period of time, and allow us to use some smart intelligence to be able to suggest to that person, you should try this. And based on that quote-unquote prescription of lifestyle, use biomarkers which are blood-based, which are digital-based, epigenetic. We're just doing some experiments on epigenetic and microbiome as well. Maybe that will be included in the panel going forward. But use biomarkers to actually know, is our lifestyle prescription of use to the individual, and bring that person into the experiment. Because ultimately, they want to be empowered to look at their own sense of health and data to know which journey is best suited for them, or frankly, if this is not working, and whether I should need to do something else, and make it a data-centric conversation with that human being that we're trying to empower, i.e. our patient.
So that's a fantastic vision. I want to take the rest of our time and I want to explore 2 specific sets of kinds of questions, okay? First question, what I thought made this conference so interesting was the intersection, although I'm not sure everything intersected, the amalgamation of 3 very different views of what healthcare might be. The first being what I'm going to describe as heal the sick, right? We have 25% of the world already has NAFLD, 1 or 2% of the world already lives with advanced fibrosis or cirrhosis, and certainly the advanced fibrosis cirrhosis people need help, and they need help now. So we talk about drugs, we talk about diagnostics, we talk about a whole bunch of different kinds of omics as a way to understand what's at the heart of the disease. Step 1 back from there, and you get to what we call disease prevention. In this case, I think mostly among the less aware. People in the world who have NAFLD tend to live in lower socioeconomic environments, tend to eat worse diets, tend not to have any regular intersection with or interaction with healthcare at all. If, in fact, everybody were appropriately trained, the focus would be less on fatty liver per se and more on all-cause metabolic prevention. We know about the links between obesity, diabetes, and fatty liver, for example. And then step 1 back from there, and now we're talking about the empowerment of data consumers, which is really where you are. Providing tools for the technologically aware and self-empowering to improve their own health. And now, historically, the view has been manage their own health, but you're not talking about management. You're talking about improvement. You're really talking here about the use of data to optimize the individual health experience on the planet. Those are 3 very different different visions. It is to Jeff's and Jörn's credit to take these three visions and put them into this same event. I'd like you to comment how, in your mind, having been a clinician, having been a research physician, and now being a data empowerment entrepreneur, how you see those three pieces going together in the world over the next 10 or 20 years as data becomes cheaper, technology becomes more prevalent, and this disease also becomes far more prevalent.
Let me just say that I absolutely love the way you very beautifully, Roger, articulated in much better words than I could have ever dreamt of the power of what we just experienced over the last 2 days in Barcelona. Considering it was such a concise, efficient agenda, we were able to cover all of these things. And I think to Jeff's vision and to Jörn's vision, this has an amazing capacity to create real global change in the years and decades to come. I'm hugely excited by being able to participate in a small way towards that agenda. You spoke exactly the thread that excites me, which is about this idea of optimization. I think mitigation, management, curation, these all have very, very important places in society and will continue to play an incredible part. And this is where sort of pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, diagnostics, all of these things comes in. But I truly believe that if we as a planet are to address the unsustainable economic costs of health or disease, I should say, to our global economy, if we are to alleviate the suffering that exists today, principally because of a very systemic creation about the food industry, about agriculture, about energy creation, about urbanization, all of these things which are affecting the human experience and more, I think we need to use the tool that we have, which we currently have in our greatest advantage, which is data, which is a tool ultimately. It is a tool that can be leveraged, that can be manipulated, and that can be crafted in a manner to optimize that human experience. And if we're doing it to enhance what a person buys or watches or wears or travels or communicates or holidays or purchases, etc., why can we not do it to the most fundamental basic of everything that we have, that we care the most of, which is our health and our time? And sort of that's the vision. And that's why I believe that unlocking this power of data, which in no way is perfect yet, but I think by having all of these smart brains together in the same room and by getting their experiences and their wisdom and their knowledge and understanding how this particular facet will integrate with some of the other pathways that you just described, whether it's the acute management or the chronic or the diagnostic or the pharmaceutical, etc., I think it has a very, very important part to play across that ecosystem.
So the interesting question there is, how do they converge? The way the world works today, different socioeconomic strata and different sets of issues. The reality is that while fatty liver disease tends to tilt towards the socioeconomically underserved, fundamentally anybody can be sick. Most of the people it happens to, though, fall into that second category, inadequate prevention and inadequate knowledge about prevention, which is really cheap. The third group, the group that seeks to optimize, tends to have a different set of goals for their lives and a different level of economic resource to put towards that. So what I'm wondering is where the intersection is. And specifically in your context, how far over time can this optimization via app vision take us as a world? And what will be the determinants in terms of how fast it and whether it gets there?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question. And I remind everyone that this is in many ways the journey. I'm just looking if I have a pen. I do have a pen. I have a biro. And it's interesting to know that devices like these were some of them were created for using on the International Space Station, much like any other technologies that we have, like GPS, microwaves, telephones, etc. All of these now have massive impact on everyday lives, but they were originally created for a very specific use case. And it was the democratization of that tool and that technology which has allowed it to create so many different facets and influences in our day-to-day lives. So we may see a platform or an application such as the one I presented, Mito, as one being for those who are looking to optimize themselves. But it is not unrealistic to imagine that with the right tweaks and with some fundamental changes happening on the background, one of which will be an increasing commoditization of consumer devices that creates these devices and are no longer being limited to the very few, but being widely available to everyone. Number two is, as we see an increasing amount of 4G, 5G, Starlink internet technology, the ability of everyone, every human being around the planet to be connected in real time to data, to a cloud, and send and receive information and education and awareness to be the second. And I think COVID has been the great digital transformation of our time. Again, a sentiment that I mentioned in my conversation, where today you interview 100 patients, 93% of them will say that they are now comfortable in engaging virtually through an app with their healthcare provider. This was not the case 2 years ago. that number would have been less than 10%. It's 7, 8, 9%, right? So there have been massive changes to our world and the way we behave and technology, et cetera, et cetera. So I believe that whilst right now the experiments are happening for a limited group of people, and I completely appreciate that sentiment, I think if we can bring our minds to it, we can increasingly move that technology to allow for that great bottom of the pyramid and empowering them with these small, simple, but ultimately prescriptive and personalized recommendations for them to help push that health span window as far back as they can. One of the biggest fundamental problems of health is the fact that as well as looking at health outcomes, hard primary outcomes or secondary outcomes, we also need to factor in that this is as much of a behavioral sciences problem as it is a hard health or physical health problem. That is a very, very different problem to solve for. There are very specific thoughts that have to go into making that problem. What we can try to solve for right now is an audience of people who are health conscious. And when I say conscious, I mean committed, i.e. they're doing something about it, but they may not know whether the thing they're doing is the right thing for them because there's a scarcity of time that all of us experience in our day-to-day lives. So how do we ensure that we're telling them, prescribing to them the right thing that they can be doing, and then helping monitor and track that information over a period of time? I hope that as an industry now, and I'm speaking sort of as a digital therapeutic or a prescriptive digital therapeutic industry, I hope there is a period of time as we're able to get the science right in terms of the smart intelligence for the prescriptions and the recommendations, we can then learn from the other things that are going on around us, which are more behavioral change in their science, whether it's nudge theory, whether it's gamification, whether it's reward incentive, all of those things which exist. And let's also be honest that there is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. As we're talking about carbon tax, sugar tax, as we're talking about ease of access to parks, what is the ease of access to actually pick up a bottle of high fructose corn syrup juice in a supermarket? There's so many systemic issues that also need to be solved for as well. And they're not easy to be done.
Only one more question to ask, which is we've addressed the issue of resourcing and how that translates. Here's the rest of it. People are not particularly good intuitive statisticians. I am a statistician by training. And one of the truths we live with is that statistics are counterintuitive. How do you envision the app being able to use that and at the same time provide people with data in a way that they find it credible and educating while dealing with the biases around statistics and medicine that you're likely to encounter?
That's a massive problem. I completely agree with you. And I think the first design feature which we are looking at very acutely is the simplicity, just ensuring that it is just one dashboard which is being presented to the end user. I think one of the biggest challenges that exists right now in this TG, and I include myself in that, and you've seen the devices that I wear, and we've spoken about it multiple occasions, that you have this siloed data which currently sits in. Like if I'm looking at my CGM data, it is sitting in the device manufacturer's app. If I'm looking at my Apple data, it's in Apple Health. If I'm looking at my Ring data for sleep, it is in the Ring dashboard, etc. And in a person, in the user's head, they're having to integrate and bring those numbers together. So I think the first thing that we're trying to do is ensure that simplistically these 3 or 4 different streams are put in one place and there's some degree of inference that can be made across them. The idea is not so much necessarily to ask the individual to interpret their data and then decide and choose what they should be doing. The idea really is to present that information to them and show them that based on this, and this is where the smart intelligence comes in, if we have a pre-diabetic and they specifically are looking at maybe improving their glucose variance through the day, then some of the hacks might be specific forms of activity after specific types of eating and showing to them how those glucose curves have flattened over a period of time when they've eaten a particular way, when they've done a particular form of exercise. If they have a hypoglycemic event, show them that it may not just be because of the food you've had, it may be the fact that your REM sleep last night was really poor, or the fact that your heart rate variability was so low, indicating a stress response. So there are some simple things that can be illustrated in a simplistic dashboard to allow people to understand.
And one that I certainly will be interested to see as it evolves. I'd love to be able to share with our audience some of your journey as you go there.
I'd love to do that. Thank you.
Today's episode of Surfing the NASH Tsunami has been sponsored by Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, a clinical-stage biopharmaceutical company pursuing novel therapeutics for NASH. Madrigal's lead candidate, resmetirom, is a once-daily, oral, thyroid hormone receptor beta-selective agonist that is designed to target key underlying causes of NASH in the liver. Resmetirom is currently being evaluated in 2 phase 3 clinical studies, Maestro-NASH and Maestro-NAFLD-1, designed to demonstrate multiple benefits in patients with NASH. Madrigal served as a leading sponsor for the Innovations in NAFLD Care 2022 conference we are reviewing in this week's episode. For more information, visit www.madrigalpharma.com.
And now for the Season 3, Episode 24 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava. I'm now 24 hours back from Barcelona, dealing with a bit of jet lag, noticing we don't have that much business to discuss this week. One comment first, though, being in Europe, closer to Ukraine, closer to Russia, and talking with folks who live maybe several hundred or just 1,000 miles from the war, you get a sense of how real it is in their lives. We are somewhat insulated over in the States, and on moments like this, I remember that more. Here goes the business report.
The first episode of our new podcast series, The NASH Tsunami in Diabetes, Getting Ahead of the Rising Tide, will post on Thursday evening, May 24th. Look on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and follow your email for more information.
Our first episode features our co-host Ken Kusi, plus Stephen Harris and Kathleen Corey from Harvard and Mass General, and Kay Pepin from Resounded and the Mayo Clinic. The conversation focuses on papers published over the last 2 years that demonstrate the need to take fatty liver disease in diabetes patients more seriously. This is the same kind of information that led to the upcoming ACE guidelines that will be released on Thursday of this week, and we will talk about in episode 2 of the diabetes series.
We have filled some easel sponsorship slots in the past week, but there are still openings.
I already discussed easel sponsorships last week. We've filled a couple of slots since then, but we have attractive slots available with plenty of room for extras or interviews. I will be publishing some data on likely listenership and value of sponsorship later this week on LinkedIn and Twitter, and we'll send notes out to people we've been talking to about that subject.
It appears that our weekly download totals have achieved a higher plateau, with a different download pattern.
On the buzz front, the tsunami consistency records keep breaking. 10 weeks over 1,000, 6 in a row and 7 of 8 over 1,200, 4th straight week with 2,500 list downloads over the previous 28 days. Last week I mentioned that an increasing percentage of weekly downloads are for episodes less than 1 month old. The historic number for less than 1 month old was 45 to 48%. Recently it's been more like 50 to 52. This week, recent downloads hit 57% of total, the highest we've ever seen. Now that said, we saw higher than expected downloads for some full episodes earlier in the year, and by that I mean more than a month old. Season 3, Episode 9, about liver nursing support. Episode 11, about the thinking behind the NAIL NIT Consortium. Episode 14, about balloon hepatocytes. And Episode 18, previewing last week's Innovations in NAFLD Care conference. Before I go, one more thought for people getting back into the swing of overseas travel from the U.S. You will need proof of a negative COVID test no older than 24 hours before your exit flight. Abbott Labs has a product that comes with a way to have a medical professional observe you taking a test in your hotel room or anywhere else you want and validating the result. Otherwise, you will need to reserve 1 hour the day before you depart for the States to get tested. I missed a session of Saturday's conference because that was the only way I could get the test. But when I go to London next month, I plan to take the correct Abbott test with me. The website emed.com is probably the best way to be sure you've got the right stuff to get this done. With that, I'm off for the day. I want to thank our team, Magic Mike, Eric, Steve, Murph the Magnificent, for an unusually productive week with me out of the country and preparation ongoing for the NASH Tsunami and Diabetes first episode. I want to congratulate Jörn and Jeff one more time for a superb conference. And I want to thank you, our listeners, who keep downloading and signing on to our various source pages to keep up to date with us. Keep your eyes open in the coming weeks for announcements about new opportunities to engage with this podcast. And with that, I'm totally done. Stay safe, surf on. I look forward to seeing you next week again on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.